speak into it.
Like this. So I have to speak into it and read my notes at the same time. It's up to 3. Can you hear me now? Is this better? We can get it up even further. How's that?
Better.
Great. It gives me a great deal of pleasure to welcome you here tonight and to welcome our wonderful speaker, who is both a lovely and distinguished neighbor of the library. She lives right across the square in the beautiful, elegant yellow house, and commutes between here and New York, where she's the associate curator of, now I have to look at these because there are a lot of syllables, in the Department of Decorative Arts at the Metropolitan Museum. As curator who is responsible for post-Federal 19th and 20th century furniture in the American Wing, she mounted the lively, scholarly, and highly acclaimed show, Art in the Empire City, New York, 1825 to 1861, which closed in January. I had the pleasure, as I think many, many of you did, to go to that show, and it was absolutely terrific. It explored how a confluence of economic, historical, cultural forces gave rise to a highly productive period in the arts of this country and established New York as a great and vibrant city. Catherine, in the conversation we had a few weeks ago, mentioned her great passion for the period and for the furniture of that period. And in more than a matter of style, 19th century New York furniture and interiors, I think we're in for a real treat, sharing with her her passion and her wonderful deep knowledge of the subject. But before I turn the stage over to her, I'd like to note that in addition to being a project director, she was also the co-editor of this catalog, which is, I can hardly lift it, is a really wonderfully impressive work. It looks daunting when you first lift it and glance at it, but it is a wonderfully wonderful read, really, and may not be an all in one day or one night, but it will be over a period of time. I think really worthwhile for everyone. Kitty and Regan have copies of it at the Bookmart. We have copies here at the library that are in circulation. Those are in hardback, and then you can also get the softback, the soft cover from the museum itself. And finally, I would just like to say a few more words about Catherine's many accomplishments. She received her BA from Smith College and a Master of Arts and Master of Philosophy from the Graduate Center of the City of New York. In addition to her most recent show at the Metropolitan, she organized the exhibition The Decorative Arts of Frank Lloyd Wright, and in 1995 was the co-curator of Herter Brothers Furniture and Interiors in the Gilded Age. And I will now turn the microphone over to her, and she's going to speak without any notes at all.
Well, thank you, Beth, for a very nice introduction. I'd like to thank Beth and Nancy Young and Kitty and Regan, who have organized this evening's event. It's very flattering to be invited to speak to all of you, and I'm very flattered that so many of you have come. And I'm going to pause to take the knot out of this. Thank you. Tonight I'm going to tell you a story, and the story is all about 19th century furniture, which is what I work on at the Met. In the American Wing, we have very large and broad collections, and we have 6 curators of American decorative arts, of whom 4 work on furniture. That gives you some idea of how specialized we get. And I work on the period that has been, I'd have to say, historically most neglected. I've been waiting for the chance to speak to a New England audience. This is actually, I guess, my second New England audience. But in a region which was the center, or had so many centers of production of high-style cabinet making in the 18th century, the material that I work on is generally less well known to most people, and I think that most people have carried throughout the 20th century broad generalizations about the 19th century. It was the era of industrialization, therefore all this stuff is mass-made, and none of it has any quality, and all those styles. I cover all those styles: the Greek Revival, the Gothic Revival, the Rococo Revival, the Egyptian Revival, the aesthetic movement, the arts and crafts, etc., all of which you'll see a little bit of tonight. And I think that this has not, the phenomenon has not been well understood. So I hope that after tonight's talk I will have convinced you to at least have a new open mind about this material, because at its best it really is quite spectacular, beautifully made, very inventive from a design point of view. And Let me see. And before I actually get started and we turn off the lights, I would like to just, more on behalf of my friends at the Book Mart, mention some nice new news about our book, Art in the Empire City. I just had a letter this week from the New York Public Library, which informs us that it's been chosen as one of the 25 best books of this last year in all categories. Which is, what was a 5-year project was not all for naught. And then the Times Literary Supplement will have a big special art and architecture issue this coming week in which this will also be discussed. So let us just begin, and let me define the parameters of what I'm going to show you this evening. And I assume you can all hear me. I'm not seeing any waving hands. Okay. Oh, you know what? We need to just turn on the light behind us.
Here, I've got it.
The story, as it turns out, really centers on New York City. Now that we've done the project called Art in the Empire City, which was at the Met last fall, we have a much clearer idea of the second quarter of the 19th century, that period between 1825, when the Erie Canal opened, and 1861, when the Civil War began. Those two historical events really changed life in America in considerable ways, which I'll describe briefly. I think when we started the project, which really we started talking about 10 years ago, and started working on in earnest about 5.5 years ago, 6 years ago, we just had the idea that as the Metropolitan Museum, with the largest and most important collection of American art, we would do everybody a favor by addressing American art during the second quarter of the 19th century because it had not been touched. And it's that period of time which encompasses the Hudson River School, landscape painting, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, the invention of photography, and all these decorative arts, most of which, as I mentioned, had been quite neglected. And then it took a while for the project to gel, and finally, as it often happens with these projects, a light bulb went on, and the then chairman of the American Wing, Jock Howitt, whom some of you know, and I were discussing this, and he said, you know, really, New York is the focus of the artistic activity. He said, yes, you're right. It's really true that after 1825, Boston, Philadelphia, sort of just receded into the background, and New York, which had always been the major financial center, a major manufacturing center, now combines its great deep port of New York, can access the whole opening of the rest of the country via the Hudson River and via the Erie Canal, which goes from Albany to Buffalo, which you'll remember from the famous song. That gets you to the Great Lakes, and that gets you to the rest of the country, and neither Boston nor Philadelphia could match that because those cities were both blocked by mountain ranges, and Boston, sad to say for Boston, had a port that at that time still would freeze, which New York's did not. So New York just went into turbocharge. The opening of the Erie Canal in 25 was not the only thing that made New York a great city, but it was the sort of final chink in the puzzle that sent New York into this period of enormous growth. And here you see on the screen an 1848 print of New York from Lower Manhattan. The view taken or conceived from the steeple of St. Paul's Chapel, which is in the lower left foreground. And what you're seeing is Broadway and its commercial traffic, and at the very end you see Trinity Church marking the end of Broadway. Throughout most of our period of this first half, and I am actually going to speak to issues that... Is this crackling too much? Should I turn down? Okay. I'm going to speak to issues in furniture that take us right up to about 1880. But for the first half of our project, I'm really depending on the new research that we did for Art in Empire City. So you see the city closely built, the busy port beyond. Most of the city at this time, before the Civil War, was concentrated below 14th Street. And here you see a map that shows us, sorry to say I don't have a pointer, but that straight up the middle line is Broadway. Broadway being then the main street, the street around which all of the sort of carriage trade was organized, the fancy shops, Tiffany & Company, Lord & Taylor, Brooks Brothers, and all of the high-style cabinet makers for the most part. On the other side, you see the gray section, several wards of New York, and it's labeled Klein Deutschland. This is what we now call the Lower East Side. And it, too, was a center of cabinet making during this period, but mostly the sort of smaller shops, and the shops that were producing lower-end goods, which were shipped out of New York literally by the ton. down the eastern seaboard, over to New Orleans, up the Mississippi, out to California, over to Mexico, even as far away as China. Or, conversely, up the Hudson to the Erie Canal and out to the rest of the country. We're not going to focus on that stuff because at the Metropolitan Museum that's not what we collect. And my mission is to convince you that some of the 19th century things that were made during my period were really quite extraordinary. This is a 1855 view of Broadway, which just shows you some of the buildings, the scale of the street. They were sort of 4 to 5 story buildings, fairly narrow, but what you can't tell is that these buildings would protrude back into the center of the New York City block, very often connecting in the middle of the block with something coming from the other side, Mercer Street being on the other side of this view of Broadway between Prince and Spring. Travelers' accounts talked about Broadway, the bustle and the roar and the clang and the things being unpacked and unfurled and buildings going up and coming down, and it was ever thus in New York City. It was dangerous to cross the street, prompting Mr. Jenin, a famous hat maker, to propose building a bridge across Broadway, which he didn't ultimately do, but somebody did in 1867, so that the customers could get across safely and buy the goods on the other side. But all of this is part of New York's growth. And of course, the growth of New York is fueled by the influx of people. New York grew between 1825 and 1861 from a relatively small city. It was, a relatively regular-sized city, let's put it that way, of about 120 or 25,000 people to just short of 1 million people in the metropolitan area. Or actually, if you count the whole metropolitan area, it was 1 million people, making it, by 1861, the largest city in the Western Hemisphere. 1 million doesn't sound like much to us today, but then it was really big. In 1847, there was a Philadelphian, Sidney Fisher, who wrote in his diary, "I've just been to New York, and it makes Philadelphia look village-like." So the scale of this was quite extraordinary. I wanted to make a point. One of the great misconceptions about the 19th century is that everything was machine-made. This is not true. For one thing, in New York, the huge influx of European craftsmen meant that hand craftsmanship was dominant in many industries throughout most of the 19th century. Here you see a woodcut from about 1835 or 36 from a manual of professions, and these are probably German craftsmen by then, making furniture by hand. By the time of the Civil War, or shortly thereafter, some of the cabinet makers did acquire steam-powered machinery, but these tended to be for big jobs, for planing boards and that sort of thing. There's a wonderful account in the Scientific American in 1880. There's a kind of front-page article on a firm called Schwenkhuizen, and it shows in little vignettes that they have all the fancy machines known to man at that time for woodworking and cabinet making. But in the article it says, well, we have also carving machines, but we find it so labor-intensive to keep the knives and blades sharpened and to reconfigure them for all of the different styles that we're issuing constantly, that we find it less expensive to have 40 full-time carvers. And so these little stories tell you that this is a picture of about 1915, a firm called Schmieg and Kotzian, which was a long-lived firm in the 20th century. I think it lasted well into the 1940s. And here these guys are at their benches with their hand tools, just to make the point. New York was at sea level, of course, and so not near, unlike Grand Rapids, which also had a burgeoning furniture industry starting in the 1850s, was not near a great falls or something that would, some falling water that was going to generate that kind of water power. And steam power was fairly expensive. So if you had relatively cheap and skilled labor, you did it that way. I'm now going to embark on my series of explaining to you about different styles in the 19th century and what they mean. It's funny. I did come without notes, but I actually had notes, and never mind where they are. They're in New York. So I guess I'll just have to paraphrase all the quotes that I would have read to you otherwise. So much of all of decoration and interior decoration is all about fashion. It's all about style, and it as it is today. And New York was setting the style for the rest of the country. And New York considered itself from the very beginning, both consciously and unconsciously, New Yorkers decided to become a world-class city on a par with London and Paris. And that was their ambition. And you can see from this watercolor dating to about 1830 by A.J. Davis an important architect of the period, in the classical style, that New Yorkers aspired. Whether this is a real interior or an imaginary proposal for a client, we don't know. But you can see at a glance how elegant a lifestyle New Yorkers intended to lead. This is a double parlor with an ionic colonnade at the end, a double colonnade. Big mirror over the mantel on the on the mantelpiece on the left, and other big wall elements. In its overall configuration, it follows very closely the spirit of pattern books coming out of England, particularly in this case Thomas Hope's Household Furniture and Furniture and Decoration of 1807. That's a paraphrase too. Sorry for the lost phrases here. You see this, and this might actually focus back. This is a close-up of this image. You see, I'm just showing you the center table, of which there are two, with great paw feet and a concave base, which Davis included in his watercolor, which in fact is of type that we know, and we showed in the exhibition, was actually manufactured in a practical sense by New York firms. This is by Deming and Bulkley, a New York firm that supplied Charleston and plantation owners. This was made for the governor of South Carolina in 1829. And it's a really marvelous piece. I hope some of you did see it. It's a rosewood veneered piece with an elegant piece of black marble, so-called Egyptian marble, which was more expensive than white. And it has really exquisite gilded decoration. Reading from top to bottom, the gilded decoration emulates different other types of surface decoration. There's a horizontal band with swans dipping into a fountain, and this almost exactly copies a known gilt bronze mount of English origin made in Birmingham in the period. That sort of floral center piece on the base is very closely emulating what Thomas Hope had suggested with his drawing in his book of 1807. You see this sort of Athenian design. This type of table actually has roots in the Renaissance, as everything does. Everything gets reinvented over and over again. But here they've emulated marquetry, which would have been lighter colored inlaid woods, but here in gilding. And then to either side are painted in gold, but with light and shade, snub-nosed dolphins, which of course are replacing carving. And then you have these elegant big paw feet and these curling sort of acanthus leaves underneath. And as I say, closely following Thomas Hope. Now, this is the same type of thing. I probably would have to say that this is in the Cleveland Museum. Those toenails were never gold, I bet you. But the green, sort of dark green, verdigris feet would have been correct. And this is labeled by the firm of Joseph Meeks and Sons. And the label that it bears says that it tells us, because due to our research, that it has to have been made between 1829 and 1835. Well, interestingly, this table bears the same exact label, 1829 to 1835, same firm. So you can see at a glance that something happens between 1829 and 1835. This marble column, gilt bronze mounts, gilded stencil decoration, big paw feet, gives way to mahogany veneered, big scrolling forms, equally elegant here, a piece of black marble. I think we had white on this one. That's, as I said before, less expensive option, but an entirely different conception of a pier table. Now, you probably all know what a pier table is, but for anybody who doesn't, it's a piece of furniture that is placed between two windows and generally has a long, tall mirror above it, and they almost invariably have a mirrored plate underneath the table surface. And so in combination with the mirror and the table, you get a long reflective surface between two windows, which are transparent surfaces, if you will, and casting light back into the room. Well, around 1830, we get the first wave of German immigration to this country. About 125,000 people came to, Germans came to New York, and about another 500,000 after 1840, and particularly after the revolutions of 1848. This made New York the home of the largest German-speaking population outside of Berlin and Vienna at the time. And that said, the Germans only represented about 15% of the New York population. The Irish, of course, were the largest immigrant population, representing about 30%. But the Germans were very highly skilled, generally well-educated, and they infiltrated any number of industries and dominated them until the end of the century. Cabinet making happened to be one of them. Sugar making was another one, beer and bread making, hat and shoemaking, which were all just in front of cabinet making, which turned out in this period to be the 5th largest industry. So this is big business. And you start to get these big scrolled forms with veneered surfaces where the wood has just been chosen for the color and the highly figured pattern of the wood. This was in our exhibition. I think it's one of the really best and most successful of this type of furniture, which was called, as was its predecessor, both of them would have borne the title at the time of modern Grecian. Modern Grecian you might get with the paw feet and the columns here, but I think when you get to this style, it's really about denoting simple geometries in sort of an affinity with, if you will, with ancient Grecian architecture. That's about as close as it gets. The style was widely disseminated. Germans tended to settle in other cities as well, and throughout the Midwest, and parenthetically, they tended to settle by the city of origin. So we had a lot of Burgundians in New York, and Hamburgians went, I think, to St. Louis, and etc. But this kind of furniture, made in the 1830s and 40s, was widely emulated all across the country, so much so that it became virtually a national style. One British visitor to a New York interior during this period pronounced the furnishings decidedly Republican. And in that sense, it meant for, not the way we use Republican today, but of course, but for every man. And it becomes very difficult if something isn't labeled, or depending on the woods used in the construction, it becomes very difficult to say whether something was made in New York or Cincinnati or somewhere else. But that's why during the course of our research, we made a big effort to just choose things that could be documented to New York, so we could set out some chronology and some benchmarks for other people to build upon. This is a very, very famous document in the history of American furniture of the 19th century, because it is dated 1833, and it's Joseph Meeks and Sons broadside, which shows their product line in that year. And it's a fascinating document. It's a great big lithograph. It's really actually a tour de force of lithography of the period, which is one of the other art forms that burgeons and blossoms during our period after 1825. And you see at the top their cabinet workshop on Vesey Street. This is in Lower Manhattan. And you'll just have to sort of take my word for it. The top registers, about the first 17 images you come to, are cribbed entirely from an important pattern book of 1826, published in England by a designer called George Smith. That would place the upper registers here in the modern Grecian style of the late 1820s. But you can see at a glance that everything below that is participating in this new veneered style. So just about 1833, or in response, one could say, to this big influx of Germans that begins in 1830, we are seeing this radical change in style. It probably reminds you, or at least I hope it does, of German Biedermeier furniture. And of course, that's exactly what the inspiration probably is here. As well, in New York, being the great port that it was, could get all manner of not only skilled immigrant labor, but rare woods. These wonderful rosewood veneers and mahogany veneers are coming into the port of New York. And of course, there are now veneer shops that cut these veneers for the cabinet makers, and these thin sheets of wood with these highly figured surfaces. This, too, was in the exhibition, and I can't tell you who made it, but based on construction in woods, we're pretty sure that it was made in New York in the 1830s. Well, it has to be in the 1830s because the lock, made in Connecticut, dates to between 1835, I think it is, and 1841. But it's the most vibrant. It's a fall front secretary, and it's the most extraordinary piece of veneered furniture that I have come across so far, because I hope you can see even in the far back reaches of the room, that the mahogany veneer is so lively that it's almost as though someone lit a match underneath this piece. It's got big flames going up through it. Of course, the way it works is that you put a key in the keyhole at the top and bring the top half down. That forms the writing surface. But it's big, it's bold, it's contained. It's a contained shape. Big sort of geometric elements with this, again, very vibrant veneer. And I will point out while I'm right here, in the inset panels and the recess of the top half, you also see little pointed arches, a kind of early harbinger, hint of the Gothic revival, which is also kind of steaming along at the same time, which I think we come to just now. These lollipop feet with discs applied are also are an unusual element, again, coming out of Biedermeier furniture, but this idea of applied discs is very much a New York element, very much part of the vocabulary of Duncan Phyfe, whom we'll come to in a moment. Now, meanwhile, during the 1830s, while all of this is going on with the Germans and the Meekses and the dispersal of New York furniture in ever-widening circles, I should have probably mentioned that the Meekses in the 30s opened up a warehouse in Savannah, one in Charleston, one in New Orleans, and were disseminating this stuff all over the country. So during the course of earlier research by Wendy Cooper, now at Winterthur, a labeled Meeks table in the house called Melrose in Natchez, Mississippi, just gives you some idea of how these things were dispersed. But while all of this is going on, there is a sort of renewal of interest in the Gothic, emanating from England under the aegis of the prodigious designer and proselytizer A.W.N. Pugin, who during the 30s, among other things, was designing the interiors for the Houses of Parliament in the Gothic style, which he proclaimed the true Christian style, the true national style of England, the only appropriate style for architecture of public buildings and churches, and et cetera, et cetera. This being, of course, a reaction against the classicism of such folks as Christopher Wren and others. This is an image, a color plate, which, again, I think it actually might focus a bit, but published in 1825. Do you want to try that, Beth? Just give it a little twist. 1825, it's variously ascribed to Pugin himself, thank you, and to his father. I think that's perfect, and I think you're just going to need to keep your hand on that just a little bit for me, because autofocus isn't as subtle as we are. Anyway, so you see that this is 1825, and Ackerman's Repository, a serial publication coming out of England, is starting to publish designs in the Gothic style. This is a plate that A.J. Davis actually kept among his own papers. And he starts to design in the later 1830s houses, really castellated villas in the countryside for some of his clients. He was the great classicist of the 1820s, but now he takes up the Gothic style. And one of his famous and still extant buildings which you can visit is Lyndhurst in Tarrytown, New York. I hope some of you have been there. He designed it initially between 38 and 42, and then goes back after the Civil War and enlarges it for the second owner, again in the Gothic style. So you see several phases of A.J. Davis. This is one of probably the earliest pieces of furniture that he designed for that house. It's a pair of hall chairs, a stiff little, sweet little hall chair in oak being one of the preferred woods for the Gothic style, and this matching up of styles with woods is very much part of the 19th century mindset. Here he has, it's quite a stiff little chair. He's taken to heart the advice of a man called J.C. Loudon, who wrote a household, sort of a book about architecture and designing the interior. Loudon, a British writer, very much advised that the architect should take charge of the whole project, the outside and the inside and all of the furnishings. This was a radical idea at the time, and Davis took it very much to heart and did that at Lyndhurst, for example. He also relied on Loudon for moments of inspiration. The wheelback, the chair is typical of the early period of Gothic revival in that it takes the idea of tracery for the back. This is like a little rose window on the back of this chair. But actually, when you go through Loudon, you find that there's a whole page of cast iron table supports, and there's a cast iron table support that is the spinning image of this chair. So he literally took an element that intended by Loudon for an entire other use and then adapted it to his chair. And this kind of sort of picking and choosing and inventiveness is very much part of the American mentality. This is one of his later little side chairs, and one of my very favorites in the whole history of 19th century furniture. It was conceived probably in the later 1850s in conjunction with another of these castellated villas called Herrick Castle, no longer extant. But it's a little walnut chair, again, loosely adapting the idea of tracery for the back, standing on little canted legs with little deer hoof feet, en point, in second position, if you will. And it's here shown in its new upholstery. I don't remember if I brought you the yes, I did. You see how sort of lumpy and undistinguished it looked when it had this not original upholstery in it before. But for the sake of our exhibition, I'll just go back 2 steps. Using such sources as these with a very sharp box edge and some of Davis's own drawings, as well as many period sources that informed us about the use of blue and a gold-colored tape. Loudon was very big on gold-colored tape. We've recreated the box seat, which I have to say, from a point of view of upholstery, was very difficult because of those turreted legs, as they're called. They sort of protrude from the seat rail, making it a challenge for the upholsterer. Then I hope you can see that how the center elements just sort of wrap around the top of the crest rail. This is, in a manner, really much closer to poured metal furniture, i.e. cast iron furniture, which was still a very new idea, kind of invented in England, if you will, in the 1830s, and by the late 40s being made in New York. Clearly inspired Davis, who we don't know that he made cast iron furniture, but the aesthetic of it is very much apparent in this chair. Now, on the same front, during the 1830s, we can begin to see the growing influence of France in the work of none other than Duncan Phyfe, whose name I assume is familiar to all New Englanders. He's well known as one of the major figures in New York cabinet making of the Federal period. But I wonder how many of you realized that he was in business until almost 1850, and he too changes with the times, going into business with his sons and making very elegant and very restrained first classical and then French-inspired furniture for clients, particularly in the South, where he had a huge following amongst Southern plantation owners. This little chair is of a type that he made for his daughter Eliza Phyfe Vale when she married in the late 30s, I think 1836 or 7. And it is probably inspired by a drawing like this, that wood focus, by Théodore Pasquier. It's one of the French pattern books of the 1830s period, and clearly well known to Phyfe. Now, lest you slip into the assumptions that many people make about this kind of phenomenon, here's Duncan Phyfe, he's copying Pasquier, oh well, that makes it sort of lesser. I really urge you to realize that this was common practice. Everybody's cribbing from everybody else, just as everyone does today. And there was absolutely no hesitation or shame in doing so. This piece we had in the exhibition, it's a couch, that is the proper English term for what you probably are fond of calling a recamier or a meridian. It does have its roots in French furniture of the 18th century, but if you're Duncan Phyfe, it's a couch. And it's covered in rosewood veneer, and I hope you can see this maybe better in this detail, this flat arabesque banding that outlines these complicated scroll feet, and indeed outlines the entire piece. This very detail is something that's coming out of so-called old French styles, the Louis XIV revival and the Louis XV revival that are coming into fashion about 1840. This piece was part of a huge shipment of furniture that Phyfe supplied to a southern plantation owner in 1841. Now, about that time, actually starting in 1839, a French designer called Désiré Guimard is one of the first in France to start publishing serial, monthly, if you will, or bi-monthly, I'm not quite sure at the moment. In 1839, he starts publishing colored lithograph designs for furniture and interiors and draperies, mainly furniture and draperies, of which this is just one plate, showing what would have been very high style in the early 1840s. Now, I'm sure you all look at this and think, oh my God, it's just so ugly. But that's okay. You know, the aesthetics were different then, but I assure you this would have been the epitome of good taste by about the mid-1840s. And here is a New York painting that was not in the exhibition, but a New York family in their classical drawing room. This is not necessarily the same drawing room that we saw before. In fact, it differs considerably from A.J. Davis's, but the idea is the same. It's a house on Bond Street that was built around 1830. And here you see, I hope, near the fireplace, some of these types of chairs that have been inserted into this interior to update it. This painting from about 1850, we think. Now, starting in the 1840s, the love of things French just washes across New York like a tidal wave. There's just really no other way to describe it. And I haven't yet exactly gotten to the exact bottom of the issue, like why exactly does this happen in the 1840s, but I guess it has to do with fashion and taste. It has to do with Americans' forever love of European aristocracy. There was a great quote that I have another big project going on at the moment, and I left it in that project notebook down there in New York. But anyway, but just to say that there are these great accounts of people talking about the French being spoken in the drawing rooms, and that plus the furnishings means that you could almost, if you close your eyes, imagine yourself in Paris. Everyone is imitating the nobles, and everyone is refurnishing from the basement to the garret in the French style. Moreover, the greatest of the English cabinet warehousemen, and they may actually have been referring to Duncan Fife, who in fact was Scottish, has, I think it was in 1843 or 44, the New York Mirror reported that he had dumped all of his English-style furniture at auction last week, and he has sent to France for workmen and models. And so whatever it is, around 1840, 41, 42, 43, everything related to British, which was a dominant factor up until now, is out. And that's not to say the Gothic revival doesn't sort of continue to kind of creep along in the castellated villas out in the countryside and all, but if you were in town, Louis XIV was what you had to have in your drawing room, or Louis XV. This chair is a Louis XV style. You will recognize the cabriole legs and the shaped back. It's part of a large suite in the Met's collection that descended in the family of the first president of the Metropolitan Museum, which is why we have this and yet another suite, which I'll come to in a minute. This chair and a couple of other pieces in the suite are distinguished by the fact that they bear their original upholstery. And this is really quite extraordinary. It's not only the under upholstery, but also the show cover, the silk brocatelle, which of course would have been imported from France, from Paris or Lyon, because American mills never did make fabric of this caliber. They just didn't. That was one of the many things to have an elegant lifestyle in New York that you got from somewhere else. This chair, in fact, was made in Paris. It's ebonized, probably it's fruitwoods, pear or apple, and beechwood, all of which are associated with French cabinet making rather than New York cabinet making. And it was purchased in part of the suite was purchased in 1843 by James Collis, a New Orleans merchant who retired with his fortunes to New York, but who went to Paris and to Europe generally during the early 1840s to escape the aftermath of the Great Depression of 1837. This period that we're discussing had great economic vicissitudes and also great fires that regularly burned down New York City, meaning it had to be rebuilt. But 1837 was devastating economically, and anybody who could afford to went off for a grand tour. Collis was one of them. And in Paris, he bought furniture for his townhouse, which he was going to inhabit when he got back, near Washington Square. He bought the furniture from a man called Auguste-Émile Ranguet-Leprince, who the American clients all referred to as Ranguet. Ranguet seemed to speak English fairly well, and he built up quite an American clientele. So the suite came back. This was quite a status symbol because the import duties on imported French furniture were 30%. And so Howard Henderson, who was one of Collis's friends, wrote to him when I think Collis was in Italy and Howard Henderson was still in Paris, and he said, "Oh well, American furniture will have to do because I can't afford the duties." And this was the type of American furniture that cabinet makers in New York, realizing that there was a growing market for these things, realizing that many people couldn't afford to bring in the other stuff, went into business making the same style. This is Louis XV style furniture, not original show cover, by Charles Baudouin, who sounds French, but who was actually a third-generation American by the time we find him working on Broadway in the 1850s. But that said, he's very an entrepreneurial type. This was made as part of a large suite made for James Watson Williams of Utica, New York, and it is still in the Munson Williams Proctor Institute there. That just prompts me to say that anybody who was anybody in Utica, in Albany, if you were in Troy, if you were decorating your house and you wanted something really special, you all came down to New York and you tramped up and down Broadway to find the best stuff. This furniture was originally upholstered in a green fabric, we know from accounts of the day. The exercise of American cabinet makers following French design sources is really cogently made by this little pair of chairs in the Met's collection. They are clearly the same idea. The scalloped edge, the voided cartouche in the back of each little side chair is actually a very unusual element in American Rococo Revival furniture, and by that term I'm encompassing the revival of all of 18th century styles, Louis XIV and Louis XV. That's what gets called Rococo Revival. But that voided cartouche, that asymmetrical bean-shaped space in the back, is unusual. And at first, when we had the little chair with the red upholstery on it, given by a descendant of the Meeks family, and therefore perhaps by that firm, a later incarnation of that firm. And I bought the other little chair because it was clearly another cabinet maker working in the same mode. I hope you can see at a glance that one is the one with the yellow striped upholstery is just a little more lively and spirited in the way that the shapes are handled and the sort of frothy scalloped edge and all. I started looking in 18th century English sources at first, thinking that's where I was going to find Rococo revival ideas for this, but no. French, Guimard, Lagarde Meuble, this series of lithographs coming out every other month or so. 1844, there it is. All these guys had this kind of material, and they were inspired to copy these things. This is, like the Meeks broadside, one of the great monuments or images of 19th century interior decoration of this period, because they're so rare. In views of any American interiors in this period are incredibly rare, which is odd because in Europe you find ladies doing watercolors of their drawing rooms, and there are huge numbers of these things in England and in France, etc. This is published in Boston in 1854, but it's credited to Anthony Kimball of New York, the parlor of a refined gentleman, I think the caption goes. And you can see this is, it might focus a tad, a very lively kind of kinetic version of the Rococo revival style. These pieces of furniture fairly wiggle with energy. And it's interesting because it's all sort of the period, it's all following the European lead, but the commentary that accompanies the picture says that although Mr. Kimball has important European connections, i.e. he's backed by his uncle in Mainz, Germany, Mr. Bembe, although he has these important connections and he's up to date on all the current fashions, he's really making, it says, an American version of the current European mode. And it's just so telling that this was seen as American rather than European, at the same time that it is European inspired. And one could say the same for J.H. Belter, another German working on Broadway. This piece from Not Original Upholstery. This is how people think that this furniture should be upholstered, in bright red or purple. But I'm here to tell you that by the 1850s, red for rosewood, which this is, was very much out. Nonetheless, this is one of the most grand and glorious of the Rococo revival sofas that we attribute to Belter. This is from the Milwaukee Museum. We had it in the show. I hope some of you saw it up close. Belter was well known for his laminated bentwood furniture, thin rosewood veneers glued together at perpendicular angles, made a very, very strong bond, the grain going at perpendicular angles, which under using steam and pressure he pressed into a mold and made these forms that curve in several dimensions. Then they are pierce carved, and some of these baskets of flowers and applied blossoms, the dominant motif is floral, are carved separately and applied. But one could say it's an American version of a European idea. Now, in 1853, New York stepped out on the international stage of world culture in another way by hosting the first World's Fair held in this country. It was called the Crystal Palace, and here you are looking at a view of Manhattan from 43rd Street, from the vantage point of Ladding's Observatory, which was then considered one of the tallest structures in the world. I think it was some 350 feet high, and you paid admission and you could clamber up there just as we do now, go up to the Empire State Building or the World Trade Center to get a view of the city. Now we're well beyond 14th Street by the 1850s, and you can see how dense the city is, but I hope you can also see that as we come close to 42nd Street, which is in the foreground, the building starts to peter out, and you still have big green lots. And above this, it's still very rural and very agricultural. What you see in the foreground on the left is the Croton water distributing reservoir. Croton water was brought to the city by 1842. And to the right, you see the so-called Crystal Palace, a big glass and cast iron structure which emulated the that held in London, the big fair in London in 1851, under the aegis of Prince Albert. This was a big deal for New York to try and take on London. And this fair had no government support, but it did have 4,000 exhibitors. And here New York, as I said, stepped out on an international stage and compared itself with its European competitors. And anybody, that will focus, I think, anybody who was anybody in the cabinet-making trades submitted a piece of carved furniture. This by Alexander Roux and Étagère Buffet, as the term was, as this type was called at the time. Great carving was the hallmark of great cabinet making in the mid-century, about in the 1850s. That defined the great cabinet maker of the day, and Roux was certainly the kingpin on Broadway at the time. This is a type of sideboard for the dining room, which was conceived in France in the late 1840s, was quickly adapted here, and became de rigueur for everybody's dining room until about 1875. And you can see at a glance the motifs are that of bounty, which is appropriate for the dining room. There are game birds and fish and fowl of all kinds, and berries and nuts, and hunting dogs at the top and framing a stag's head. Very typical hunt theme for these pieces. This is black walnut, also thought to be appropriate for dining rooms. Here's a little image of some of the exquisite carving. And I have to say that in terms of construction, carving, and style, and choice of style, these things are as fine, if not finer in many instances, than anything being produced in France at the same time. This, I regret, is backwards. That's my fault. But this is the 1860s view of a New York dining room, and you see such a piece on the side, left-hand side in this case, Contest for the Bouquet by Seymour Guy in the Met's collection. Also shown at the fair was a suite of furniture by Julius Dessoir, who, despite the fact that he sounds French, was actually a Prussian, working on Broadway near Belter and Alexander Roux. And for the longest time, all we knew about him was this line drawing, made at the time from a daguerreotype, so we can take it fairly literally, a daguerreotype of a suite of rosewood furniture he submitted. Lo and behold, a few years ago, I was invited, and I think that'll focus, to a household in New Jersey where this chair, one of a pair, and the related sofa were presented to me. They'd stayed together for 150 years. And gratefully, the entire suite was given to the Met in honor of its 125th anniversary. That's the great thing about our collection, is that we have not just one example, but we've got the whole suite, and comparative examples and study collection and the whole 9 yards. It became a challenge. This would be considered Louis XIV. Hallmarks of that are the tall back, the low seat, the trapezoidal legs. This is, of course, not really emulating anything made during the era of Louis XIV in the early 18th century, but that's what they considered the style to be, and it would have been the epitome of high-style taste in the 1850s at this time. It's beautifully carved. You may not want to live with it yourself, but you have to appreciate these things on their own intrinsic merits. It was a long and patient search for what to do about the upholstery. This is how it arrived at the Met, with its garish red and white flocked upholstery. After much to do, I guess I took out the extra comparison. After much to do, we went with a fabric, off-the-rack English fabric that's a kind of a long story. I don't have time to tell you the whole thing, but sort of a meandering floral pattern. We had good idea that the original was green, both from period source material and from the fact that in the tack holes, our brilliant upholstery conservator, Nancy Britton, was able to determine the original colors of the show and the original weave of the show cover. We spent a long time trying to emulate the weave structure, but it didn't work out. But this is how it's upholstered now, and that would have been right for the 1850s. That, of course, is how people think it should be, and it's not. Gustav Herder was the young Turk on Broadway at the time. He had come as part of the great wave of German immigrants after the revolutions of 1848. He bypassed Klein Deutschland, or Little Germany, on the Lower East Side, did not get involved in any of those lower-end shops, went directly to the top, was in business by the early 1850s, and submitted 3 big pieces of furniture to the Crystal Palace, of which this monumental bookcase some of you saw recently came to light. Where? In an upstate Syracuse antique shop. If any of you see anything you think might be of interest to me in your wanderings, please call, because it does turn out that a lot of these things are just sort of out there. Gustav Herder was, I think, maybe 21 or 22 years old. He needed inspiration for this Gothic bookcase. This is, again, oak, very difficult material to carve. And when he signed himself in, when he emigrated here and signed himself in, his naturalization papers describe him as a carver, as a sculptor. The glass is not original. He opened the pattern book of Thomas Chippendale, the 3rd edition of Chippendale's director, pointed to the Gothic bookcase, and the form and massing emulate that absolutely. But he has changed it considerably with the carved decoration. Here is one of the 4 figures of the arts. This is architecture, deference to my husband, a medieval figure holding a little medieval cathedral. Now, Then we have the next World's Fair after 1853 is held in Paris in 1855, and the Louis XVI style is really sort of introduced there. And interestingly, this chair was acquired by John Taylor Johnston, first president of the Met, for his music room shortly after part of a large suite now at the Met, for his music room in about 1856. The upholstery is not original but emulates the color of the original. And I think you can see at a glance the difference between this and the Louis XV style that John Taylor Johnston's father-in-law had purchased in Paris in the 1840s. It's a much more sort of rectilinear style, turned tapering legs and a much sort of squarer back. And this, too, was made by Mr. Ranguet-Le-Prince, except for one thing. He's now working in New York. After the revolutions, he decides to skip out of France. Everything's in disarray. There's no clientele there. So he comes with his brother-in-law, Léon Marcotte, sets up business, and starts to expand his American clientele, and John Taylor Johnston among them. Now, Herder starts his own business in 1848 and becomes, by the time of the Civil War and thereafter, the firm of Gustav Herder and subsequently Herder Brothers becomes the most important of all the cabinet-making and decorating firms in New York. And this is to say, and I have to, okay, thank you, that by now, by the late 1850s, these cabinet makers are not only giving you furniture and upholstered furniture, but they're giving you a whole interior. You need a drawing room, we'll get you the imported carpet, in this case from England. We will get you French-style paintings for the walls and the ceiling. We'll make you high-style furniture, again, rosewood being important for the drawing room. And this is an image from the drawing room of the Victoria Mansion in Portland, Maine, a house that still exists, known also as the Morris Libby Mansion. It's sort of open between Memorial Day and October, and if you're up in Maine, you really must stop in Portland and see this. Needless to say, the brown corduroy upholstery and the baby blue upholstery is not original to these pieces. And I don't think I've put in, it was originally champagne-colored silk with little gold-embroidered red silk buttons in the tufting. All of which is to say that this is in the pastel tones of the 18th century revival that is being spearheaded in France by Empress Eugénie, wife of Napoleon III. They have come to power in the early 1850s. Napoleon III is emulating, in his sort of personal style, is emulating his uncle Napoleon Bonaparte. But Empress Eugénie wanted really to be Marie Antoinette, and she was, of course, living in all of Marie Antoinette's old houses, if you will. So she goes about redecorating all of the imperial residences, Fontainebleau, Compiègne, Saint-Cloud, the Tuileries, etc., and in the pastel tones of the 18th century. So that's where this harks from, and you can see at a glance, this is a comparison with a watercolor of 1860. I should have said that Victoria Mansion dates from 1858 to 1860. Here is Princess Mathilde's drawing room in France. She's I think, cousin of Napoleon III. At the same exact moment in time, you see the big medallion-painted ceiling and the pastel tones. Here the furniture is white, not rosewood. Oops, just to compare. And here, the reception room with its little anteroom off of that in the Victoria Mansion, with a great sort of secretary cabinet, if you will, that we did have in the exhibition. I just wanted to show you its context so you could see the painted decoration, the white marble mantelpiece, the pastel-colored rug on the floor. But this is the piece that had never actually left the house until we brought it to Art in the Empire City. And you'll see at a glance it's a little different from the Rue sideboard, for example. This is not now brown wood. It's bird's eye maple with some rosewood highlights. It's a much more architectonic piece, that is to say, much more emulating architecture. I am of the opinion that the expansion of the Louvre at this very time is reiterated in the arched roofline, if you will, of this piece, and in other elements. It has engaged columns, and there are many architectural elements that we could point out here. As well, at the 1855 Paris Exposition, there was a new version of the Renaissance Revival style that cabinet makers such as Desiree Guimard, who we've mentioned a couple of times, were exhibiting. This is Guimard's presentation in 1855, and I think you can see at a glance the correspondence. Again, you would never mistake this for a piece of French furniture. It has many elements also of the Louis XVI, late 18th century, in that panel is inset into the front. Here it's painted, not porcelain as it would have been in the later 18th century. And then you see a little inset marquetry panel also in the 18th century style. This is a pure American invention of the moment. After the Civil War, there's yet another style introduced by Empress Eugénie et al. In France called the Neo-Grec, which becomes the dominant style of the 1860s. And in this country, nothing sort of exemplifies it better than this little side chair by Herder Brothers. And from now on, I'll be relying on Herder Brothers to make my stylistic points, because they are the one firm of the later 19th century who has really had in-depth monographic study. We did a show in 1994-95, and so they're the best of the best, and we might as well look at the best while we're at it. But in any number of ways, this is a very typical little medallion-back side chair of the 1860s. This made for the Lockwood Matthews Mansion, still extant in Norwalk, Connecticut. But one can compare it, oops, a slide that has slipped, but with any number of little French chairs of the period. But there the comparison really ends. I mean, there's so much liveliness to lead the eye. Little lotus blossom tapering feet, tapering legs up to little ionic capitals, gilded stop flutes. All that's happening on the styles is very much from the Herder vocabulary. In the back there's this little carved knot, which is just a gem, a little gem of decorative element. Here's a detail of those legs, the lotus blossom feet, the gilded flutes, the little ionic capital, the gilded stop flutes above, and a little carved, a little sculpted bit that mediates between the leg and where the leg meets the seat rail. You don't want just a plain old right angle there, you've got to have something pretty. The greatest expression of Herder Brothers in the Neo-Grec style was Thurlow Lodge in California, a house built by Milton Slocum Latham, who was for various periods the governor of California. And this is his music room, photographed by Carlton Watkins, the great Western photographer. And in the back reaches, you can see this monumental mirror, which we had in the Herder show, some of you will remember, which is Herder Brothers doing the Neo-Grec. There are engaged carved griffins, there are these grisaille, that is to say gray and white painted panels, these classical heads with sort of Anthemian headdresses, and lyres on the top. In all manner, the vocabulary is very much this 1860s Neo-Grec, or Greek Revival style, as it was called. This was 14.5 feet tall. It was quite a job to install it. And interestingly, it's finished on the back in rosewood, which suggests that it was shipped to California in parts and then finished on site. A little detail from that room shows this little chair, which we know from Le Garde Meuble of Désiré Guimard, lower left, is probably a French import. So by this time, everybody's just getting whatever they need of high style for the interior. Now, in the early 70s, 1870, 71, there's the Franco-Prussian War, and France becomes much less of a progressive design force at that time. Napoleon III has to retire